and they're expecting to get 250K in return, let's say, it's not about letting go of these three people. It's about making these three people do the job of, six people, but more efficiently within the same amount of time.
Welcome to Process Pioneers, the show that takes a deep dive into the minds of decision makers, key influencers, and process experts who are pioneering the world of everything process.
So welcome to another episode of Process Pioneers. Today I have the absolute privilege of sitting down with Shruti Sood. She is a process improvement and transformation leader at 7-Eleven and has an extensive, global experience over the last 10 plus years. She's been working in India, the UK, now in Australia, working with various companies such as Rolls-Royce, NBN, and now 7-Eleven. Shruti, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for giving me the opportunity to do so, Daniel. Thank you so much.
Great. So what we might do to begin with is I've given you a brief introduction, but I think what would be good for our audience so they have a bit of a grid, a bit of a framework for who you are and the background and experience that you're coming from. Maybe you could take us all the way back to the start of your BPM journey. Tell us where the interest first came from in regards to process management, and then I guess a brief history and timeline leading up to where you are and what you're doing today.
Absolutely. So I think when I go back to all these years ago, I've been working for like 10 plus years now, and it makes me sound really old, but I started my journey obviously back in India where, a lot of BPM people start as business analysts. And that's exactly where I started off with a company called Wipro Consulting Services in India. And that's where I learned my first key skills about what's BPM all about, what are the key things to look at from a business process perspective, keeping all the jargon aside, just in terms of what are the key tips and tricks to learn. I got an opportunity to work with Rolls-Royce through Wipro at that time, which was a great experience because Rolls-Royce was upgrading its technical architecture, and they needed a bunch of a whole core program management team to manage the migration of that enterprise suite from the current system to the new system. And that's where a lot of the focus came out on, yes, we are upgrading to the technology, but what about the underlying processes? So that's where I think I learned a lot. We spent 2 to 3 years with that company developing the BPM from a level 0 to what we called at that time to a level 2. I think. But it was interesting because the company wasn't really BPM focused, but the department we worked with was very BPM focused.
Right.
So great journey therein. And that pretty much got me to the BPM, the mindset, the BPM structure. I also got an opportunity to work with the British Telecom at that time. And British Telecom was also very structured because they had a focus on the ETOM framework, which was the Telecom Operations Management Framework. Big believers in they adhered to how the structure was at level 1, level 2, level 3. So I got very, very I think pedantic about all of that, the jargon, etc. In the most recent years, actually, other than BPM, I've also got interested in how does continuous improvement and project management fit into BPM. So for me, that's an interesting facet because when you think about BPM, it's a bigger focus, it's the big picture, it's the big frameworks. But I think continuous improvements and project managements then tend to give you the tool set to break that big framework into smaller problems.
Yes.
And that's an approach that I've recently started adopting. So, not being static and stuck to your frameworks, but starting to break things down into smaller achievable wins. Really learned that mindset when I worked with NBN more recently here. Again, a company very focused on BPMN, but also very focused on continuous improvement. So that kind of enabled me to get to now 7-Eleven, which is starting, I would say, really, really starting its BPM journey. We are at a very basic level. It's got the right attitude though, but it's also got a great focus on CI and project management. So it's been an interesting journey, starting with a very structured organization to a very, very dynamic playground here in Australia. And I'm loving every bit of it.
That's great. So talk to us a bit about when you were working in that organisation where they had a very heavy BPM focus in that department, but maybe not enterprise-wide. How did that work, and was it something that it was designed that way, or was there some sort of push to get the whole enterprise adopting this BPM mindset?
Actually, yeah, absolutely. So I think with that organization, the interesting challenge was, like I mentioned, we had the department that was really focused on getting it right. To break it down, right? When I mentioned that they were doing a technical upgrade, they were talking about moving 600 applications in the course of 6 months from system A to system B, which sounds fair. It's a big organization called Rolls Royce, but you needed to break it down into achievable chunks. So it was, I think what helped at that point of time was because even though the entire organization was not focused on the BPM journey, was not structured in its approach, but I think the biggest positive was we were very structured. So we had, there was a lot of preparation that went in. Like one of the biggest benefits I found with working with BPM toolkits and frameworks is the toolkit itself. So if you've done a good preparation to say this is where we're trying to get to, right? And this is the toolkit we need. So we have people who know exactly what we need to do. So they could probably be given material like this. I mean, I'm just giving random examples to say they probably don't need that much of a journey education. They probably don't need that much of a spiel. But then you had people who had no idea what we were trying to achieve. They felt that they could do this job better than us, probably because they handle that application on a daily basis. So we had to let them know that, look, we've got this toolkit here. These are the benefits of doing this in a structured manner. We could achieve it for you in 2 months versus if you did it alone by yourself, it would take 3 months. So we bring us, a time-saving benefit also. So it was about, there was a bit of a people element that we had to work very closely with. It wasn't as seamless as, systems got this benefit, let's move on. No, we had to consider the people really closely and adapt the toolkit as per the people we were working with.
Right. Now, you've obviously worked in different organizations at different, I guess, BPM maturity levels.
Yeah.
Talk to us about, there's probably going to be people listening to this interview or podcast where they're at the beginning of their journey as well. And I guess having come from an organisation that's very mature in the way they tackle or handle BPM, talk to us about what are the right ingredients? What are the things that these organisations should be looking for and planning for when embarking on this BPM journey?
Oh, I love that question because, this is where I love to give some knowledge. But I think first and foremost, when people start talking about BPM, you'll find like countless definitions on the World Wide Web, right? Like you just have to break it down into chunks. The word BPM typically stands for business process management. But to me, it's all about, and you'll see me using this word really often, it's the toolkit. It's the toolkit that you equip people with, or the toolkit that you equip your organization with to get them to that next level, right? So with the toolkit, there's lots of options out there, right? You could look at the right kind of people that develop your toolkit. So who is it that you've got working on your BPM frameworks? Who is it that you've got working on your BPM journey? And this is always a mix of, obviously, internal SMEs, people who have been with the organization, but I also feel there's an element that a fresh set of eyes always brings to the table. So, somebody who's probably not very closely entrenched with the company can always bring you a fresh perspective. So the people is always a good starting point. Definitely in terms of the process knowledge that we have at the end of the day. And like you mentioned, when most organizations are starting off with that BPM journey, the process knowledge is all mostly and in the head, right? And different people have a different perspective. So I think a core principle of BPM is let's get the process down, documented, modeled, visualized, but also let's make sure it's that one standard process that everybody can refer to. Because if you have 10 different versions of the same thing running, it's never going to be an effective practice. It's never going to be efficient the way it is. So for me, I think documentation of the right process knowledge is another key element of the toolkit. I think that, and there are lots of tools out there to do it, right? Look, I'm fairly tool agnostic, so it's all about, what you want to use. There's like tools like ProMap out there. There's Microsoft Visio, the tool that everybody loves to hate. You can do it on, seriously, we complain about Visio all the time, but it's what we all go back to at the end of the day. There's PowerPoint. So it's things like this that I don't want people holding back people, but it's about your people, your documentation. It's also, I think the right toolkit also needs to have the right metrics in place, because success to me looks different to what success might look to you. So
Right.
for you, the right measure of what the process runs from A to B could be 2 hours, but I think that it could be done more efficiently in 3 hours or whatever. But
Right.
that's a conversation starter. But if you don't have metrics, then we're not really documenting the process for the right reasons. Because you've got to have a barometer for where are you going on this process journey. So
Right.
I think for me, metrics is pretty much third element. And
Yes.
once you've got a right combination of people, the knowledge with the documentation and metrics, you can then start having discussions around the systems. I mean, the system for me is honestly the last piece of the puzzle. That
Yes.
you've got Intex, you've got, like I said, ProMap, I remember way back we used to use Aries all the time, in terms of a BPM. But to me, that's always the last piece of the puzzle. It's always about the people, the documentation and the metrics, and also about what is it that we're trying to achieve with BPM. And let's not do it just because it's the right thing to do. You need to have a vision around the maturity you want to get to. So that's pretty much the core elements for me.
That's good. Now, obviously, you need to get buy-in from senior management if there isn't already. And so when an organisation is looking into BPM or adopting a BPM framework or mindset, what are maybe some of the objections or some of the resistance that might arise for I guess, taking on a BPM approach?
The interesting objection I always hear is one of my pet loves, which is documentation. I mean, a lot of organizations also feel, and I've heard this a few times, that, we don't have time to get into, documenting everything. We don't have time to do the as is, let's just get to the to be, let's just get to the should be. But it's an interesting challenge because I get it. If you're ultimately going to improve, why are we wasting time, spending weeks and months typing out and mapping out what you do today? So that's a big objective and to be fair, senior management really doesn't care about the detail, right? They care about the benefits, they care about the big picture. So they care about where are we going to get to. But it's a key challenge that we've always learned to override or just convince them that, look, documentation and the right fundamental is key. So that's been a journey. It's also about, I'm trying to think, for me, the documentation has been one of the key challenges to work with, but it's something I fight really hard for because I'm a big believer in documentation. So you just have to convince them that if we get it right, we'll be efficient about it, and then we can just move quickly.
Right. And obviously, I mean, you were talking about continuous improvement earlier. You're talking about obviously not just documenting the processes, but that continuous management, that incremental improvement. And then obviously you've got the radical innovation that fits in where you can take a very, I guess, long and resource heavy and time inefficient process. And break that down or reduce that to something that's much more efficient. Talk to us a bit about, I guess, the incremental improvements that on the day-to-day, and then compare that with the radical innovation and when it makes sense to do both of those.
Interesting question, though. I think, that makes a lot of sense because you're right, like different organizations approach this differently. Like some are all about the big bang win, some are all about, let's just get to the end point, and some are all about let's just do it phase by phase. If I use like an example from one of my recent projects, right? So we've had, so I think with my recent experience at 7-Eleven, we work in a business where it's all about supplying food, or it's all about supplying, drinks and food opportunities to our customers. But I have to say things like, with that comes the issue around food waste. And I think in this environment, like food waste is is one of those things that everybody wants to be seen as a step ahead. But you can't also just get into food waste and just say, let's just hammer out a quick win. And let's just say from tomorrow, we'll tie up with this charity organization and then just, get it done. Because interestingly for us, it's not about us as a head office taking that decision to say we'll partner with this company and just get it done big. We have 700 plus stores, and we have to take into account each store's comfort to tie up with our organization, each store's the waste equation that we have to go into. and also in terms of each store's capacity to handle the new process that we roll out to them, right? So in a scenario like that, it becomes very difficult to do a big bang approach to say from tomorrow, all of the 700 stores will have to tie out with this charity. With this sort of an approach, we tend to work with incremental benefits. We tend to do a more phase-by-phase approach. So we'll probably start with a cluster of stores that are more adoptive of new technology, of new processes. If they adopt that technology or the new process well, then it's a matter of rolling it out to the second cluster, the third cluster, and then you can probably have a bigger rollout to the others. So we started a few trials in the first quarter of the new year, to be honest, because we really wanted to get into the food waste and have an efficient mindset around that. Unfortunately, with COVID-19, things like this have been put on a back burner, but the food waste issue has now become a big problem for us, right? It's actually become a bigger problem than what it was from the beginning. So now the whole cultural mindset has suddenly shifted from being incremental. And actually till about last week, we actually said, look, we have no choice, but we have to go all out with all the stores and just get this done. So it was interesting to see that even from time to time, you might just have to be flexible enough to change your approach. You just have to be constantly flexible, I think, in this sort of a BPM environment.
Yes. Now, obviously, when in rolling out something new to the different stores, you were talking about having the different clusters. And starting to work with, I guess, the ones that are more adoptive of new systems and mindsets and methodologies, I guess. I guess obviously you need to get that buy-in from senior management, but you also need to get that buy-in from the different departments and the people that are working on the I guess the frontline staff. In your organisation, you've got the different stores. In another organisation that maybe doesn't have storefronts as such, it's more I guess it would be unrolling it out in different departments. But how would you, I guess the question I'm trying to get to is how would you get buy-in from the general employee? Because obviously, I mean, I've heard of different approaches. For some people, some process specialists and managers, they try and make process sexy. They try and make it attractive and enjoyable and fun to try and get people to adopt it and to use it. Talk to us about whether that's a challenge that you've experienced and how you navigate that.
Great question, because I think keeping in mind the fact that we work with these 700 stores and each is an individual onto themselves, that's a great question. I think the biggest is the biggest key, or the easiest, not easiest, sorry, the best way of fitting for me is always, and I know it sounds floofy, but it's always like tacking that benefit statement onto that person, right? So there's two things to it. There's tacking that benefit statement, like what does this department or this store or this individual want out of it? And then trying to see that, can I make it seem beneficial for them, right? Now that sounds very labor intensive, because if you start now customizing your solution to each person that you have to train to, it just is very labor intensive. So one of the approaches that I've always seen is, I like that person who said making processes sexy. I might have to have a chat with them. But one of the things I really like doing is making so a key part of process, new rollouts is trainings and comms. So I try to bring that element of fun into these trainings and comms, right? Like we did a process rollout the other day, not the other day, haha. I wish it was, but we did this process rollout a few months back, where we were actually rolling out the reporting framework around ticket management and incident management. And we were actually rolling out new categories for the store people to use. Now we realize this was fairly, they had to do this whole new process of, if they had a problem at the store, then they had to go about categorizing it. So we decided we're just going to do a fun questionnaire around it, right? So we had like a pop quiz style question. We had, we did a pop quiz. We did a training. And then right at the end of the training, we did a pop quiz for everybody. And it was a fun interactive pop quiz with GIFs and memes. And we had like users popping up and saying, who would you pick between A, B, and C? So for me, it's like I said, if it's not a big organization, then trying to formulate the rollout to the benefit statement. But rather than making it labor intensive, I'd like to make the trainings a bit more fun, trainings a bit more interactive, so that more and more people feel like they've got something to contribute, and just making them ask the right questions. So it's about making the trainings more interactive and fun for people. Like that's how I would approach it, more or less. Yeah.
Great, that's awesome. And you've obviously worked in multiple different countries. Are you able to speak into, are there any differences in mindsets or I guess BPM maturity in terms of regions as a whole? I'd imagine that in Europe, from what I know, Europe is quite advanced in terms of their process maturity. And having worked in UK, India and Australia, talk to us a bit about, I guess, the differences that you've experienced and noticed.
I love this question. I remember answering this way back in my interviews also. It's so interesting because, like you said, each geography brings with it such different types of people to work with, right? Like India is very fast, right? People are always looking for solutions there. Problem is something at the mindset. We've not even finished a problem and people are coming up with 10,000 solutions to solve it. And that's when you have to tell them, hold on to the brakes. Let's understand the problem a bit better. Then we'll go into solution mode. So that's what I found in India. Like solutions are a dime a dozen. You just have to find out which one that fits. UK definitely way more structured because they've done the problems and the solutioning. They've done the cost benefit analysis day in day out. That's just the way they think. They're also way more patient at looking at solutions. So I would say that like Rolls-Royce was a classic example. Because the organization itself needed to be very structured, needed to be very stable. I mean, they were making airplane engines, so they couldn't afford, no process maturity, etc. But what I also enjoyed about working with that organization was the level of BPM conversations we could have with the company, right? Like they knew exactly what they were getting into, but they wanted to keep improving upon the current level. So it was an interesting market to work at because there was a lot more to learn. From the UK, then I came to Australia. And the interesting bit is actually in Australia, I've worked at 7-Eleven initially, then I went to NBN, and then I came back to 7-Eleven. So it was interesting because I came from a very, very structured market and structured geography. And one of the examples I always tell people is, and this is a good thing, I think, because in the UK and in India, when I've done business cases, when I've done my BPM mapping, I worked within tight deadlines and I've done like a week, 2 days, 3 days. And I remember getting my first business case in Australia. And my manager was really nice and she's like, I need you to do this. So I said, all right, I'll have it for you by 2 days. And she said, no, it's fine. You can take 2 weeks and come back to me with the business case. And I loved it because I never worked with this, with this less stressful deadline. But again, having said that, the 2 weeks deadline meant a 2 weeks deadline. So it didn't mean that, you could just slack off. They'll give you I love what I like about Australia is that I get the flexibility and the creativity to do what I want. But I also have to be equally transparent in my deliverables. So if I have to do something in 2 weeks, I will deliver it. And if I'm not transparent enough to say, look, I'm in danger of missing a deadline or this might not happen, then it's on me to account up to it. So there's a lot of room for freedom, but you have to own up to your freedom also at the end of the day. So I like that about working here.
That's great. Now, obviously, with that senior management level, they before they embark on any project, I guess, or any exercise, they're obviously looking at what's the return on investment. Like if we spend this money, what's the return going to be, and how quickly are we going to see a return? Because if we don't see something relatively quickly, we're going to move on to something else. So talk to us a bit about, I guess, the immediate value that an organisation can achieve and should be looking at achieving, I guess, when they're starting off on implementing BPM.
Great. I think that's a great question only because a lot of people who aren't senior management or who are not looking at big picture tend to forget that it's all about cost benefit at the end of the day because we're not so close to that level of thinking, right?
Yes.
I think the biggest win for me, I'm trying to think of an example, but even if I keep it a bit more generic, it's always about tacking it down to, how much processing time or how much time does an individual just spend on a daily basis just doing what they do? Is there a level of complacency that they get in, because at the end of the day, all we are doing is, okay, look, I might try to rephrase this a bit better.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think where I'm going with this point.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's always interesting because a senior management will always ask you very clearly, right? I'm giving you 100K to deliver this project to me. What am I getting in return? And when you trickle that down to somebody at the mid or at the junior management, the first concern is always, am I losing a job? I'll be quite honest, right? The first question in people's heads about a cost benefit analysis or a business case is, am I losing my job? And this is where we as BPM consultants have to have the right mindset and also the right approach to BPM projects, right? We have to get people on this journey with us to say, look, BPM is not about cutting any head costs. BPM is not about, letting go of jobs. It's actually about creating more opportunities to upskill people.
Right.
So even if senior management is expecting that if they put in the 100K and they're expecting to get 250K in return, let's say, it's not about letting go of these 3 people. It's about making these 3 people do the job of 6 people, but more efficiently within the same amount of time. So I hope you're trying to see what I'm trying to say. That
yes, yeah.
Because I know the biggest question I've always been asked is, because when I've been trying to do my cost benefit analysis, I'll go to people and I'll ask simple questions like, all right, how much time does it take you to do this? What are the biggest errors you see? How many times do you run this step? And every time they're like, what's going to happen to my job? Or fine, am I going to do this? We did an RPA project, a robotics project at 7-Eleven most recently. And I remember that, to be honest, the vision with RPA and AI is always that, you get into the automation and then people are fairly redundant. But the way we kind of sold that project to the staff, and this is something that I was a big believer in, that we were just learning a new skill. I had never done a robotics project. Me implementing an RPA project meant that in a year's time, I'll also probably not need to be around, because if everything's running by bots, what am I doing here? But it was about the opportunity of learning something new, creating more an opportunity for me to upskill myself. And that's exactly how we broke it down to everybody involved, that it's a quantitative benefit for you, but it's also a qualitative benefit, that we're getting to learn a new opportunity out there with financial benefits, obviously, to the organization.
Yeah, that's great. And now talk to us a bit about, like, obviously, and you mentioned briefly earlier about COVID-19, with the current climate that we're sitting in at the moment. Obviously, a lot of organisations are being affected in different ways. For some, they've been completely wiped out altogether, and a lot of organisations are struggling. And then there are a few organisations that are thriving in this time because it's playing in their advantage, in their favour. But talk to us a little bit about, I guess, how BPM can play an important part in this current season. And then I guess that there are some organisations that that I've been talking with, where all procurement, all funding has been stopped. We're not embarking on anything new at the moment. And then there are those organisations where BPM has just rocketed to the top of their priority list, and they can't get started with it quick enough, because senior management's sitting there thinking, hang on a second, everyone's working from home. How do we know what processes they're following? How do we know that they're following it correctly? And how do we know that when we all come back together at the end of this, there's not going to be a huge mess that we all have to clean up?
No, such a great point, because like I said, because the organization that I'm with was starting its BPM journey, and at the end of the day, with the COVID-19, I think the biggest focus right now has been on making sure the stores are operational and making sure people's livelihoods, to be honest, aren't impacted. So BPM is still hasn't been given the highest priority at the end of the day, but without the official focus on BPM, what we've actually realized with this whole work from home approach is how fairly process heavy we are. Because for all of us to work from home seamlessly, for all of us to make sure that those 700 stores are running out there on a day-to-day basis, so the head office is a 350 plus staff, and we all call each other support staff for the 700 stores. And to be fair, 300 support staff people have been working from different locations, interacting with each other on Zoom, on Skype, or Teams. and we've made it work. So without realizing, when we initially went into it, there was a lot of worry and there was a lot of confusion. So the first week was mayhem. And soon people suddenly started getting into the structure of, look, let's just in the morning, let's catch up, let's decide what we are doing, what are our priorities for the day, who needs to focus on process A, who needs to focus on process B. And we all just started delegating task owners and process owners. And slowly, the mindset has suddenly changed from I don't know what I'm doing to I need to know what I'm doing. To then, now I really feel confident about what I'm doing. And now we're actually at a stage where people are putting up their hands to say, look, I'll train this person, or I'll, we'll buddy up and I'll deliver something together. So it's been interesting, even without the official senior management push from a BPM approach. I'm loving the mind shift, the cultural mind shift in my team and, the people around me who are becoming a lot more confident in processes, because I felt when we were sitting next to each other, we were a lot more reliant on each other. But now that we're all in remote distance locations, we're owning up to a lot more, I'm loving that. So it's all about owning up to your process in BPM, as I call it. So it's been a great mindset shift. Yeah.
That's great. And now looking towards the future, obviously there's a lot of different, BPM solutions that are coming forth. We've got process automation, we've got RPA, what you were mentioned earlier. We've got things like process mining now, where software is able to mine the data from within an organisation and model that out in a process. And talk to us a little bit about what you think, where you think we're heading in terms of BPM. What's before us? What are the new things that are being talked about at the moment? And I guess what the innovation and the advancement we're embarking on in general as a whole.
Yep. Absolutely. I think with BPM, like I constantly reiterate, even at my company, because with process improvement and transformation, it's just not about focusing on future state from a process perspective. I think BPM to me is a combination of multiple tools. So yes, you've got to have the right mix of process modeling. You've got to have, do we rely on people to deliver it for us, or do we rely on process mining tools? But I also feel it's a mix of different tools and technology. So something I mentioned at the beginning of this chat also, and something that's like in my experience, which I feel fairly confident talking about, I think with BPM, we have to bring in that element of continuous improvement, the DMAIC methodology to say, all right, we've got to this point, and how you have the levels of maturity about starting with no process knowledge to the one where you're continuously improving. But I think in olden days, it was fairly static to say levels 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5. And at 5, you reach that point of self-actualization where you said, now where do we go from here? I feel the mind shift has to be that you've got to constantly, at each level, when you reach a level, you have to constantly say, that lessons learned philosophy in project management. What did we learn from the previous journey, and how do we improve from there? So for me, I think it's an element of other disciplines that probably BPM could borrow from. We've done the modeling, we've talked about mining, we've talked about the notation, which I love, to be honest. It's that pedantic element in me. But I love borrowing from other disciplines, like what's happening in the world of Six Sigma, what's happening in Lean, what's happening in Agile that I can borrow into my BPM philosophy, what's happening in, BPM, in project management. You've got great tools like Atlassian, you've got Trello, and, you can get elements of that into BPM and not just being very much focused on this is the suite I have, and I'll not look outside it. So I think it's borrowing from each discipline that you feel best suits you. I'm a believer in that, so I constantly preach that all the time.
That's great. Now, obviously, there are 1,001 different topics and tangents we can go on when talking about BPM. It's a very broad and diverse area, but obviously we can only fit so much in 30 minutes. But for someone that's listening right now and they've been learning a lot over the last half hour, they don't come from a very BPM orientated organisation, but they want to continue that learning. They want to learn more about BPM and how it will work for their organisation. What sort of direction would you point them in? Is it to online resources? Are there books out there? Are there different communities or different influences in the space? But or maybe none of the above. But where would you point someone to I guess further that learning?
Great question. I need to find those learnings to myself. But having said that, I think I found right when I started my journey many years ago, but it's a tool that I've constantly gone back to. There used to be these websites that we would sign up to as organizations, but also as individuals. Talked about business process maturity. I think it was actually the business process maturity, some learnings, but I honestly speaking, I've just found great learning material online. Like there's a lot of us out there who do a lot of this research online. KissFlow is somebody, it's a product that we've been evaluating at 7-Eleven quite recently in our BPM journey. And other than just being a product software company, they also do great articles on keeping BPM simple. I love their language. I love the way they talk about BPM, and they break it down into achievable elements. So KissFlow is a website I recommend to even my team back at work, the ones who work for me, that just go on this article, look it up. LinkedIn, I know it sounds so obvious, but to be honest, there's a lot of us out there like yourself, who are doing great relatable stuff, because a lot of the stuff you find online, like you said, it's very jargonish. It's very much people who understand it. But when people like you, me, break it down into simple facts, I think it's a lot more relatable. So if you go on LinkedIn, if you follow the right companies you're interested in, you'll actually find great reading material there. So, and I think this is just me. I tend to keep it simple. I don't overcomplicate it. So to each his own.
That's fantastic. That's so good. I think people find themselves on the BPM journey. They find they get their start from various areas, whether they get formal qualification or certification, or whether they're within an organization where they just find themselves working on the organization's processes. Yeah. There's a whole range of ways that people are finding themselves in contact with an organization's processes. And so there's many different ways, I think, learning and upskilling and advancing those skills. So
and there's always, like, for me, BPM always comes down to what's the process, and it's a simple question of what do we do, how do we do it, how much time does it take to do it, and what would you change if you had to do it differently, right? You've got like simple questions, but again, this isn't a finite list of questions that people ask. People could come up with different variations to what they don't know, but it's all about the process. Right. Which is quite obvious. I mean, it's BPM, but if you're confident about what we want to understand in a process and how we approach it, then you're in the right direction already. Just put your process hat on, as I say, and just work from there, and you'll become a champion in no time. Like it's not a science, thankfully. It's an art. So you just got to get better at it with each approach. Yeah.
That's great. Well, Shruti, I just want to thank you so much for giving us your time today. I'm sure the people that will be listening to this are going to glean and learn a lot. So I just want to, thank you again for your time.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. It was good to, rehash some of my concepts and know that there's still so much for me to learn too. So thank you so much for this opportunity, Daniel. I had a great time.